I am going to share the philosophy that we have of why this is a building block in the 6 building blocks program. I am going to also talk about, in clinics that we have worked with, some of the activities that they have chosen to prioritize. As you've probably gathered, we have a lot of resources, and so sometimes it can be a little overwhelming to know where to start. And so I'm going to highlight 4 of those resources that we would recommend as a place for you to start. And then there's a section where we're going to talk about, just as a facilitator working with a clinic, what are some of the really kind of key things that you can do to support a clinic in this building block. And then we'll finish up with a little bit of discussion. So the reason for this building block is that whenever any clinic or any organization really is being asked to implement changes, we want to know, is the desired effect happening? And so we have to measure it. I'm going to talk to you about 3 different types of data measures that you all will use in this work. And the first thing, before I go into those types of measures, that I wanted to highlight is that I think a lot of times we think that measures have to be numbers. And I want to reiterate here that it is okay if sometimes these are qualitative as well. And I'll give you some examples of how it might not be just numbers. So if you are doing some process improvement in your clinic, the first thing that you might want to be considering is an overarching measure. And so this, you could kind of think of this as the why. Like, what is it that, why are we doing this work? What's motivating us making this change? So an example of an overarching measure that we've seen a lot of clinics use is they want to reduce the number of patients with an MUD of either 50 or 90 by X percentage, and they choose a date. So it's kind of this bigger picture, what are we trying to achieve, and like the why we're doing this work. Within that, you're going to be looking at also process measures. So this is kind of like the what, like what are we doing to achieve this broader goal of why we're doing this work. So an example here might be have an MUD on record for all of your patients who are on long-term opioid therapy by a certain date. And as we're doing quality improvement work, one of the things that I'm sure you all know is we often have lots of ideas. And the first idea that we have may not be the idea that we actually run with. So in order to make changes, we have to often do lots of tests and small tests. And so this is kind of the how of we're getting to this ultimate goal. And this is an example where I think a lot of times qualitative measures can really come into play. So for example, a qualitative measure here could be you're talking to the employees and specifically the staff who are using a new EHR template. So maybe you only pilot this within one of your pods of MAs at the clinic and over a 2-week period, and you're talking to them about what their experiences were in doing this new template. So I realize that this is kind of like a quick overview of these types of measures. And in a moment, I am going to highlight a couple other resources where if you want to really dive deeper into this, it'll be helpful to you. Often, and this kind of ties back to, pretty much all of the building blocks, it can feel hard to select what it is you're going to measure and what it is that you want to work on. So in figuring that out, some of the questions that we encourage you as an opioid improvement team or as someone who is facilitating the work on an opioid improvement team to consider is to ask, is what we're thinking about measuring, is it feasible to measure it? And then also, is it important to measure that thing? And I would actually skip around to that 4th bullet here and say, in addition to is it important, the 3rd bullet, I would say, is it something that in thinking about your peers and the other teammates that you work with, is it something that they are going to see the importance of measuring and that they're going to feel motivated around? And then lastly, and this is kind of the one that in clinics that I've worked with, I think it often gets skipped and thought of as like just an afterthought, but I would really encourage you to think about it as you go, is, okay, we're doing all of this work. How do we want to share this with our clinics or with the broader organization so that we can share what has worked, and often knowing what didn't work is just as helpful. I'm going to share some things that clinics that we have worked with have commonly done in terms of this building block. So the first bullet there is completing the self-assessment. And this is something that we've talked about it a number of times, excuse me, but this is as an opioid improvement team completing the self-assessment or as a clinic. And the reason this one is on here is in doing that, you're going to hear what it is that people think is important or what people think needs to be changed. The second bullet on here is producing and sharing baseline data reports. I would say that this one, depending on your clinic situation, can be more challenging. So basically, if it is going to be more challenging, don't let it be a hang up in starting the work. Eventually getting to a point where you're going to choose what it is you're measuring, and then picking out approaches to test those small changes that you're going to make. And this fifth one on there, I would really highlight as important, because I think as any of us who have done PDSAs know, it can kind of be difficult to know, like, okay, we're going to do this for 2 weeks. And sometimes we get busy and clinics are kind of hectic sometimes. And so it can turn into, oh, wait, a month later, oh, we haven't really revisited that yet. So when you're doing these small tests, picking a time period ahead of time and scheduling something afterward, at the end of those 2 weeks, to say, okay, this is when we're going to review this, and just getting that on people's calendars. Another thing that I want to highlight here is something that I think is really helpful in measuring success is don't let this all fall on one person. So several of the clinics that we have worked with have developed teams that are their chronic pain management teams. And so that way it's not just one person who is seeing maybe changes in the data that you are choosing to monitor, and it falls on them to kind of figure out, okay, what's the end, then what here? But rather, there's a team of people who are looking at data that you might have and having discussions around, okay, who are we going to share this with? What are we going to do? What are we going to do now? We have a lot of resources, but these are the 4 that we would like to highlight for you here. The first one is the more detailed description of what I started to describe here, of what are these different types of measures and what are kind of examples of these different types of measures. And Ashley, are you awesome? So really, this is only 2 pages, but it goes into a greater level of detail than I am able to right now with our time, but would encourage you, as you are choosing these, pull this up. It has some great examples that you might want to borrow from. The next resource on here is our Measuring Outcomes Survey. And so this is something that, and if you can click on it, please. Oh, it looks like we have our blue wheel. This is something that we have used with clinics to be able to help them see, okay, at the start of this work, here are baseline measures, and then maybe at the end of the work, this is what the end line looks like. And often what we have found, and it looks like maybe this one isn't going to open for us, but we'll let you open it on your own time. At the baseline, a lot of our clinics on this will say, we don't know the answer right now to this measure. And I would say that's really okay. And kind of, if you are the QI person, normalize that for your clinics. And if you're not the QI person and you are just working in the clinic, know that it's okay if you don't have all of these measures to begin with. And then the last 2 that are on here are these looks like that's a different one. It's okay. There's a link that goes to the prepare and launch milestones, as well as the design and implement milestones. And what these are is when you scroll down to the section that is about measuring success, it gives a list of different approaches that your clinic could take within this building block. So those are the 4 that we would really recommend just starting with before any of the other resources. So this is, I know not all of you who are on this call are maybe a practice facilitator, but I think that some of this really still can apply for you, even if that isn't your role. So you are going to be receiving if you haven't already, a workbook that is in your binder. And so I would really encourage you to use that workbook to help facilitate conversations with your opioid improvement team. So within here, there's going to be places where several different types of assessment tools and places to kind of write down what responses might be. As well as tools to use at the kickoff to get that feedback we were just talking about. So you hear, okay, the MAs feel like this is a priority, the providers feel like this is a priority, the front desk folks really want this to be considered. So you hear what different people are thinking. And if you are the facilitator, I think one of the most helpful things that you can do is be the ears and also the person that is reflecting back to the opioid improvement team. What are you hearing them say is important. So just recording what is being discussed and reminding them, okay, this is when we talked 2 weeks ago, this is what you said kind of felt important for us to work on. And the second thing that is our kind of hot tip for a facilitator is help the opioid improvement team really consider what is achievable. So looking back at the notes, like we said, what is it that they're feeling most passionate about? What do they have the ability to measure? Because yes, some of the things you might want to measure might be really challenging. And if you are the facilitator, it can be helpful to come with ideas to the team, just to kind of almost, I don't know, it's like if you're editing something, it's always easier to react to something than to come up with something that is just completely blank. So if the team that you're working with is kind of struggling to come up with different approaches, just have some things that you might suggest for them. And so some examples of that would be a number of clinics that I've worked with, maybe their EHR isn't as sophisticated. And so we have really needed to think about other ways that they would capture data. And so some examples of that might be, well, what did we do before we had EHRs? So this might be the front desk folks are keeping a list or track of how many patients are calling in a week-long period to ask for refills. Or maybe it's somebody who's going through charts and actually manually like creating a count of, all right, this many of our patients have a signed patient agreement. So even if the EHR isn't really sophisticated, there are other ways that we can do this work. One of the things that can be actually that relates a lot in terms of staff and providers is burnout. And that is something that there are several scales out there that you can use to measure that. And so depending on what your approaches are or what your priorities are, that can be a pretty easy one to basically share this type of measure and get information back about where your providers and staff are at. And I think the other thing that a facilitator really can do here is help break things down and look at, if you are trying to make a small change to see what it is like for your clinic, look at ways that this is manageable, that this is only happening like within like one team, or this is only going to happen over a short period of time, or it's only going to happen with a certain subset of patients. And so that way it just feels less overwhelming, because I think, as we all know, when something feels overwhelming, we're kind of less likely to really engage with it. Um, and related to that, my key reminder here is for all of you who are going to be on your opioid improvement teams or who are working with opioid improvement teams, is it is really okay to start small, to pick something that is a small change or a small thing that you want to measure and to build from there. I think that it's really easy in doing this work to feel like there's so much that we want to change, and that may be true, but we don't have to make all of those changes at once. It's just fine to pick something that is just feels more doable for us, and to start there.